Assistant District Attorney Claire Miller stared at the photo on her desk. The body of investigative journalist Martin Heller had been found the night before, in a dark alley, with a single bullet to the chest. Martin had been working on an investigation into corruption and financial crimes, but little was known about who might be involved. Strangely, Claire's boss seemed hesitant to dive into the case. "Let the police handle it, Claire," he had told her hours earlier, his voice low, as if afraid of being overheard. Claire frowned. It wasn't like Mark Spencer, the district attorney, to act this way. He usually encouraged aggressive investigations. Something in Spencer's tone gave her pause. "Why aren't we getting involved?" "A journalist was murdered," she countered. He looked at her for a long moment before sighing, shaking his head. "There are bigger things at play. Stay out of it." As the clock struck midnight, Claire knew she couldn't follow that advice. She had known Martin for years, and he was one of the few journalists who always sought the truth, no matter the risk. And this case smelled of something much bigger. Her phone rang, and she answered. "Miller, who's speaking?" The voice on the other end sounded rushed, almost paranoid. "Ms. Miller? I need to talk to you." "It's about Martin." Claire quickly grabbed a pen. "Who are you? What do you know about Martin's death?" The line went silent for a few seconds, and then a hesitant, low voice replied, "I can't talk over the phone. Meet me at Wilson Bridge, 2 a.m. Come alone." Something felt off, but Claire could sense the urgency. She wasn't the type to ignore a lead. Should she trust this anonymous informant? As she grabbed her bag and left the office, adrenaline started to kick in. Walking down the hallway, she ran into Detective Paul Harris, a disgraced cop she had worked with before. He looked worn out, but he still had a knack for sniffing out trouble. "Paul, I need your help. But you'll have to keep it quiet," she said, her voice calm but firm. Paul raised his eyebrows, intrigued. "Quiet? This is getting interesting. What's going on?" Claire hesitated for a second but knew she couldn't do this alone. She told him about the phone call, and Paul, always skeptical, immediately questioned it. "You think this is legit? What if it's a trap?" Claire shook her head. "I don't know, but it's the only lead I have. And Martin's death can't be swept under the rug." Paul let out a long sigh, rubbing the back of his neck. "All right. If we're going to do this, let's be careful. I'll cover you from a distance. Something tells me this is way bigger than just one murder." Claire smiled, appreciating the detective's loyalty. "Let's figure this out together." As the clock neared 2 a.m., Claire parked her car a safe distance from Wilson Bridge. The night was eerily quiet, only adding to the tension in the air. Paul watched from a distance, alert. Claire walked toward the meeting spot when a figure emerged from the shadows. A thin man, wearing a cap and visibly nervous, glanced around before finally looking at her. "Did you bring anyone?" he whispered, his voice trembling with fear. Claire shook her head, keeping her voice steady. "I'm alone. What do you know about Martin's death?" The man hesitated, but before he could respond, the muffled sound of tires approaching echoed down the road. Claire glanced around quickly and saw headlights speeding toward them. "Run," she shouted, but the man was already panicking. Before he could react, a shot rang out. The informant crumpled to the ground as the car sped off into the darkness. Paul rushed toward Claire, and all she could manage between gasps was, "This is way bigger than I thought." Claire stared at the man's lifeless body on the ground, dread creeping up her spine. The sound of the gunshot still echoed in her ears. Paul reached her, drawing his gun, his eyes scanning the area. "We need to get out of here, now," he said, grabbing her arm. But Claire hesitated, her gaze fixed on the fallen man. "He was going to tell me something, Paul. He knew who killed Martin. He's dead now, Claire. And if we don't get out of here fast, we could be next," Paul urged, nervously scanning the surroundings for any further threats. Reluctantly, Claire let Paul lead her back to the car, her mind racing with unanswered questions. Who was so determined to keep this story buried? As they drove in silence through the dark city streets, Claire felt a mix of frustration and fear. That man had been her only solid lead, and now he was dead. "I need to find out who he was, where he came from," she muttered to herself, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. Paul, sensing Claire's agitation, glanced at her from the corner of his eye. "You know this is only going to get worse, right? Someone with a lot of power doesn't want this investigation to move forward." "I'm not stopping. They're trying to silence me the same way they silenced Martin," she said, anger replacing the fear in her voice. "Someone inside the DA's office is involved. Mark's been acting way too strange. Since when does he back down from a case like this?" Paul frowned. "You think the district attorney's in someone's pocket?" Claire remained silent for a few seconds before responding. "I don't know. But he's hiding something. Something to do with Martin's death. I'm going to start digging through Martin's case files. I need to see what he was investigating." When they arrived at Claire's house, Paul parked the car and looked at her seriously. "Be careful. If you're right, messing with these kinds of people could end badly." Claire nodded, but her mind was elsewhere. She knew she was stepping into dangerous territory, but the weight of uncovering the truth outweighed any fear she could feel. After a few hours of restless sleep, Claire returned to work the next day. The tension in the air was palpable, and her coworkers' glances seemed longer and more questioning than usual. She knew she was being watched, but there was no time to waste. She headed straight to the archives, pretending to focus on a smaller case. Out of the corner of her eye, she noticed Spencer wasn't in his office. That was a relief. Sifting through Martin's old files, Claire found several notes on suspicious public contracts, fund transfers, and a shell company, Walton Securities, that kept popping up in the documents. But something else caught her attention. In some of the notes, a name was circled multiple times: Anthony Palladino. Claire felt a chill run down her spine. Palladino wasn't just a powerful businessman in the city, he was known, whispered in back alleys, to have deep ties to the criminal underworld. Was Martin investigating Palladino? Before she could process everything, her phone buzzed in her pocket. A short, anonymous message: "You don't know what you're getting into. Stop while you can." Claire's heart raced. She quickly looked around, feeling watched. This message wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. She took a deep breath and quickly texted Paul, "Found something. Meet in an hour." Paul replied almost immediately, "Safe place. See you there." Claire tucked the documents into her jacket pocket and left the archives with brisk, determined steps. As she walked through the hallway, she spotted Spencer speaking quietly with someone. He glanced at her, and for a moment, Claire could have sworn his eyes showed concern, or maybe something worse. There was no time for doubt. She left the building, each step weighed down by the growing conspiracy unraveling before her. Palladino was at the center of it all, she was sure of that. Now, she just had to figure out how deep his influence went. The only thing she knew for certain was that she was in far more danger than she had ever imagined. As Claire drove to the meeting spot with Paul, her mind raced with the new information. Could Martin's death be tied to a network of financial crimes involving not just the mafia but also untouchable public figures? When she arrived at the designated location, an abandoned garage that Paul used as a hideout in difficult cases, she found him waiting, his expression grim. "So, what did you find?" he asked. Claire laid out Martin's notes on the table between them, pointing to the circled name. "Anthony Palladino. Martin was onto something big. And now they're coming after me too." Paul sighed, rubbing his unshaven chin. "Palladino? That explains a lot. I worked on a case involving him years ago. We tried to bring him down, but the whole thing vanished. It was buried. You really want to go after this guy?" Claire nodded, her gaze resolute. "I don't have a choice. This isn't just about Martin anymore. It's much bigger than I thought." Paul looked at her for a long moment, knowing they were about to get involved in something far more dangerous than they had anticipated. "Then we better get ready. Because from here on out, we're on our own." Paul's eyes darkened as he flipped through Martin's papers. "Do you have any idea what we're up against? Palladino's got politicians in his pocket, cops on his payroll. He controls half this city from the shadows," he said, his voice low and tense. Claire met his gaze, her determination tinged with fear. "I know exactly what I'm dealing with, Paul. That's why I need to see this through. I won't stop, even if it means exposing the entire system." Before they could continue the conversation, Claire's phone buzzed again. Another unidentified message appeared on the screen: "Last warning. Stop now or it'll be too late." Claire felt the tension tighten in her body. "They're tracking my every move," she said, showing Paul the message. He frowned, standing up and pacing around the small garage. "This isn't right. They're closer than we thought. So, what's the next move?" Claire looked at the papers spread out in front of her. "I need to understand what Palladino is protecting so fiercely. This name, Walton Securities, shows up multiple times in Martin's notes. If we can trace the financial transactions through that company, we might find concrete evidence, something we can take to court." Paul nodded, but his face remained clouded with worry. "Do you have anyone you trust to access those financial records? Something like that won't be easy to get. Palladino's probably got everything locked down tight." Claire hesitated. She knew she couldn't trust anyone inside the DA's office. Mark Spencer seemed compromised, and now that she was being watched, every move had to be calculated. Then she remembered someone. "I know someone. Erin Heller, Martin's sister. She used to work as a financial analyst before she stepped away after their father died. If anyone can dig into those records without raising suspicion, it's her." Paul raised his eyebrows. "You think she'll go for it? This will put her directly in harm's way. She wants justice for her brother's death." And honestly, I think it's the only chance we've got, Claire replied, already reaching for her phone to call Aaron. The phone rang 3 times before a cold, tired voice answered. Claire? What's going on? Aaron sounded as if she had been expecting the call. Aaron, I need your help. I think Martin was onto something big before he died. I found some leads, but I need someone with your skills to track down what he was investigating. I need you to access the accounts of a company called Walton Securities. Can you do that? On the other end of the line, there was a pause. Claire could feel the tension in the air. Claire, I stopped all of this when Martin died. I don't know if I can go back to that world right now. I'm still trying to deal with everything that happened. Claire took a deep breath. She knew she was asking for a lot. Aaron, I understand, truly. But what killed Martin is still out there. And they're ready to kill again. If you help me, we can uncover this network, expose Palladino and everyone involved. We can't let Martin die for nothing. Aaron's voice grew steadier now. I'll think about it. Give me some time. Claire knew she couldn't push Aaron, so she agreed and hung up. Paul watched her, sensing her frustration. If she doesn't help, we might need to consider another approach. Did we get anything useful from the documents you grabbed? Claire shook her head. Not enough yet. If I push too hard now, I'll just tip them off. The pressure on her shoulders grew heavier with every passing minute. Palladino was a real threat, and now that she was in his sights, she knew her days of quietly working at the DA's office were over. As Claire considered her next move, Paul stepped closer. Maybe it's time we play dirty, Claire. If Palladino's coming after us, we need to move quickly and carefully. You're not going to take him down by playing by the rules. She looked at him, knowing he was right. For the first time, Claire felt she might need to cross a moral line. But how far was she willing to go? One thought crossed her mind. What if Palladino was being protected by someone she'd never suspect? His connections to power ran deep, but there was a missing piece in this puzzle, something she couldn't quite see yet. Amidst this whirlwind of thoughts, her phone rang again. This time, it was Aaron. I'll help, Claire. But there's one condition: when this is over, I want everything to come out. The whole truth. No backroom deals. Martin believed the truth should always come first, and so do I. Claire exhaled deeply, feeling the weight of responsibility. I promise, Aaron. We'll do this the right way. And with your help, we'll expose every one of these criminals. The first piece of the plan was falling into place, but Claire knew the danger was only escalating. Palladino had already tried to silence her once. The next attempt could be final. As Claire looked out the car window on her way to Aaron's house, the city felt more threatening. The buildings, the streets, everything seemed to hide eyes watching her. She knew she was playing a dangerous game now, and the rules were about to change. Aaron, finally on board, would be key to accessing Walton Securities. But deep down, Claire couldn't shake the feeling that Palladino and his allies were already one step ahead. When Claire arrived at Aaron's house, she was greeted with a tense, determined expression. Come in, quickly, Aaron said, shutting the door the moment Claire stepped inside. The living room was cluttered with papers and folders, many of which Claire recognized as part of Martin's personal files. I spent the night going through some things. Walton Securities is a front, obviously. And all the transactions look clean, but that's what worries me, Aaron said, handing over a few documents. These accounts are too perfect. Someone went to great lengths to erase any trace. Claire flipped through the papers, noticing the numbers made sense, but they didn't tell the full story. They're laundering money, Aaron continued. And from what I can see here, it's a massive amount. Millions, maybe even billions, flowing through this company without leaving a trail. Can you track down any accounts? Something that links Palladino directly? Claire asked, her tone urgent. Aaron shook her head, her eyes weary. These accounts have been meticulously separated from any obvious connections. But I'll keep digging. I just need more time. Claire nodded, feeling the weight of the situation. Okay. But work fast. They're already watching me. We can't afford any mistakes. Aaron gave a silent nod and turned back to her laptop. Claire knew every minute counted now. Leaving Aaron's house, Claire texted Paul, Aaron's in. We've got a shot. He responded almost immediately, good. I found something too. Meet me at the station in 30 minutes. As Claire drove to the station, she couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. When she arrived, Paul was waiting outside, a concerned look on his face. You're not going to believe this, he said, leading her inside. He took her to a secluded records room and shut the door. I was going through some old reports and found a connection between D.A. Spencer and Anthony Palladino. Claire frowned, trying to make sense of it. Connection? What do you mean? Paul pulled a folder from under his arm. Take a look. 5 years ago, Spencer worked on a tax fraud case. Palladino was involved, but the case was quietly dropped with no explanation. At the time, Spencer was just a junior prosecutor, but that case is what launched him to the DA's office. Since then, he's had a meteoric rise, backed by some very powerful people. A chill ran down Claire's spine. Spencer had been linked to Palladino all along? You think he's protecting Palladino now? Or being blackmailed? Claire asked, her mind racing. Paul shrugged. Could be either. But one thing's clear, he knew more about Martin's death than he let on. And if Spencer's compromised, you're in way more danger than you realized. The ground seemed to crumble beneath Claire's feet. The person she had trusted most in the office was part of the scheme, or worse, actively covering it up. She barely had time to process the betrayal when Paul's phone rang. He answered, his expression turning serious. What? What do you mean? He hung up and looked at Claire, his face pale. Erin, her house was broken into. She's missing. Claire's heart raced. Missing? She couldn't contain the panic that surged through her body. Who did this? How did they know? Paul shook his head, helpless. I don't know, but this happened way too fast. Either they're closely monitoring your every move, or someone very close to you is feeding them information. Claire couldn't believe Erin was in danger because of her. Guilt mixed with fear, but she knew she couldn't give in. We have to find her. Erin was getting close to something important. Palladino feels threatened, and that's why they took her out of the game. Paul nodded, already grabbing his coat. We'll start investigating immediately. But Claire, we have to be careful. We can't trust anyone else. Spencer, Palladino, they're all in on it. We're alone in this. Paul's words echoed in Claire's mind as they left the station. The city felt darker than before, and Claire could sense eyes watching her from every corner. Palladino had already shown he wouldn't hesitate to eliminate anyone threatening his business. Now, with Erin missing and Spencer possibly involved, the web of corruption they were up against seemed even more entangled. As they walked toward Paul's car, he placed a hand on Claire's shoulder. We'll find her. But you need to be ready for what's coming next. They're playing dirty. And if Palladino's desperate, he could try something even more aggressive. Claire looked at Paul, her gaze steady despite the growing fear inside. I'm ready, Paul. There's no turning back now. Palladino's going to pay for all of this. And Spencer too, if he's involved. We'll find out, Paul replied, starting the car and heading toward the last place Erin had been seen. But deep down, Claire knew time was against them. Every minute Erin remained missing increased the chances that they might never find her. The tension in the car was palpable. Claire and Paul drove in silence through the dark streets, both aware that Erin didn't have much time. Palladino wouldn't leave loose ends, especially now that they were closing in on the truth. Claire glanced at her phone, hoping for a message from Erin that never came. They can't just make her disappear like this. She's got to be somewhere, Claire murmured, breaking the silence. Paul glanced at her out of the corner of his eye but kept his hand steady on the wheel. If Palladino's behind this, he's probably hidden her somewhere no one would dare to look. When they arrived at the last location where Erin had been, the scene was desolate, an old, abandoned house near the railway, surrounded by empty factories. She was here, Paul said, checking the location data from her phone. At least for a while. Claire got out of the car and began searching the area, while Paul moved toward the entrance of the house. The place reeked of danger, and Claire knew someone was watching them. She could feel eyes on the back of her neck, even though the surroundings seemed deserted. Paul, be careful, she whispered as she approached the entrance of the house, but he was already ahead, cautiously pushing the door open. Inside, the floor creaked with every step, and the windows were covered in dust. There was no sign of Erin, but something was off. As they reached the center of the main room, Paul stopped, frowning. There's something not right about this. Before he could finish the sentence, a muffled click echoed through the room. Paul and Claire froze. The sound wasn't mechanical, it was human. Someone was there. Suddenly, a man stepped out from the shadows, armed, pointing his gun directly at Paul. Don't move, he said, his voice steady and calm. Claire instantly recognized that face, one of Palladino's henchmen, someone she had seen in a photo while investigating Martin's connections. You shouldn't be here, the man continued, his eyes locked on them both. Paul, always quick, raised his hand slowly, keeping his gaze on the man. We don't want any trouble. We just want our friend back, he said, his voice firm but controlled. Claire's heart was racing, but she knew she had to stay calm. The henchman gave a cold smile. Your friend? She stuck her nose where it didn't belong. And now, you two have as well. Claire stepped forward, challenging the man. If Palladino thinks he's getting away with this, he's dead wrong. We have evidence. Everything we need to bring him and his whole operation down. The man's smile faltered for a moment, but he quickly regained his composure. Evidence? Sure. That's what they all say, until they disappear in the middle of the night. Before Claire could respond, Paul lunged forward in a sudden, unexpected move, knocking the henchman to the ground. The gun flew out of his hand, and the two began to struggle. Claire rushed toward the weapon, but before she could reach it, the man elbowed Paul hard, sending him crashing back with a groan of pain. The henchman quickly recovered, drawing a knife from his belt, his eyes locked on Claire. "You're out of the game now," he growled, advancing on her. But Claire was faster. In a desperate move, she grabbed the gun from the floor and aimed it directly at him. "Stop now, or I'll shoot," she said, her voice shaky but resolute. The man hesitated, his eyes calculating. "You won't shoot. You don't have it in you. Want to bet?" Claire replied, her finger steady on the trigger. Paul, still on the ground, managed to get up, panting. "She'll shoot. If I were you, I'd quit while I could." The henchman knew he was outmatched. He stepped back, raising his hands in surrender. "You have no idea who you're dealing with. This is much bigger than Palladino. He's just a piece. And you too, you're screwed." He backed away, and Claire and Paul watched him closely until he disappeared through the back door. Claire took a deep breath, feeling the adrenaline pumping through her veins. "Paul, he's right. Palladino's just part of something bigger." Paul leaned against the wall, still catching his breath. "I know. But we need to stay focused. Erin's still out there, and if Palladino doesn't have her, someone even more dangerous does." They hurried back to the car, their nerves on edge. Claire checked her phone again, pulling up the last location signal from Erin. Something was off. "Look at this," she said, showing Paul the screen. "Her location just changed. She wasn't taken by force. She's being moved, but her signal is still active." Paul frowned, leaning closer. "You think she left the tracker on purpose?" "Yes. Erin's too smart to get caught that easily," Claire said, feeling a renewed surge of hope. "She's giving us a chance to find her. And if we're fast enough, we might be able to catch them before it's too late." As they sped through the city streets, Claire felt like she was finally getting closer to uncovering the truth. But at the same time, she knew the real enemy was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The streets blurred by as Paul drove, following the signal from Erin's phone. The location changed every few minutes but always pointed in the same direction, the industrial side of the city, a forgotten neighborhood dominated by abandoned warehouses and shuttered factories. "They're moving, but not fast enough," Claire said, staring at the map on her phone. "Maybe they're waiting for the right moment to disappear for good." Paul gripped the steering wheel tighter, his eyes focused on the road. "If this is one of their hideouts, we need a plan. We can't just rush in without knowing what we're up against." Claire nodded, but the weight of Erin's safety pressed heavily on her mind. "I know, but we don't have much time. They could be preparing to get rid of her." When they finally arrived at the location, the scene was bleak. A huge, dilapidated warehouse with broken windows and graffitied walls, surrounded by a barbed wire fence. "This is it," Claire whispered, glancing around. The warehouse looked abandoned, but the dimmed headlights of a van parked near the entrance suggested someone was inside. Paul turned off the car a safe distance away, grabbing a flashlight and his gun. "We go in carefully," he said as they both slipped out of the car and moved toward the fence. They climbed over it quietly, careful not to make any noise. As they got closer to the building, they could hear muffled voices coming from inside. Claire took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "She has to be in there." Paul nodded, and the two of them approached a side entrance. The door was slightly ajar, and the voices grew clearer as they crept inside, their eyes adjusting to the dim light. At the far end of the warehouse, a small light illuminated a corner where three men stood around a chair. And there, tied up and gagged, visibly bruised, was Erin. Claire felt a surge of anger. She knew they had to act quickly. "Let's take these guys by surprise," Paul whispered. "I'll take the two bigger ones. You go straight for Erin." Claire nodded, her mind already racing through the steps. Suddenly, Paul signaled and lunged forward, tackling the two larger men. The impact took them by surprise, knocking them down. Claire sprinted toward Erin, her heart pounding. She quickly untied the ropes binding Erin to the chair as the men fought with Paul. "Erin. It's okay. I'm here," she whispered, pulling the gag from Erin's mouth. Erin, still dazed, struggled to speak between heavy breaths. They know everything. Palladino, he's not the boss." Claire's eyes widened as she quickly glanced at Erin. "What do you mean? Who's behind this?" But before Erin could respond, one of the thugs got back on his feet and charged toward them, brandishing a knife. Paul, still wrestling with the other man, couldn't get to him in time. Instinctively, Claire grabbed the gun from her waistband and fired. The shot echoed through the warehouse, and the thug collapsed to the ground, his knife skidding across the floor. Claire stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the trigger still heavy in her fingers. Paul finally managed to subdue the last man, handcuffing him with his hands behind his back. "Are you okay?" he asked, panting as he looked at Claire and Aaron. Claire nodded, still in shock from what she had just done. "I am, but we need to get out of here. Now." Paul pulled Aaron toward the car while Claire made sure the warehouse was secure. The two men on the ground were incapacitated, but the silence after the fight was eerie. "This isn't over," Claire murmured, glancing around. She knew Palladino wouldn't stay quiet after this assault. As they drove back to a safe place, Aaron finally managed to speak more clearly. "Claire, you don't understand. Palladino isn't the one in charge. He's just a pawn. The real boss, he's inside the system. He controls everything. Even Spencer." Claire frowned. "Who is it? Who's pulling all the strings?" Aaron hesitated, still weak from the traumatic ordeal. "I don't know his name, but he controls politicians, companies, even the police. Palladino works for him, but the order to capture me came from above. He knows we're getting close. And he'll stop at nothing." Aaron's words echoed in Claire's mind. If Palladino was just a piece, then they were up against someone far more powerful. And now, they knew too much. Paul glanced at Claire in the rearview mirror, his expression tense. "That means we're in dangerous territory. We need to expose everything, fast. Or we'll be next." Claire felt the adrenaline surge again. Aaron's revelation changed everything. The enemy they were facing was much larger than they had imagined. But she wasn't going to back down. Now, more than ever, she was determined to bring down whoever was behind this network of corruption and murder. As the car disappeared into the darkness of the night, Claire knew the real battle was only just beginning. The silence inside the car was heavy as Paul sped through the deserted streets, taking Aaron to a safe place. Claire stared out the window, processing everything she had just learned. Aaron's revelation echoed in her mind. Palladino wasn't the boss, just a piece in a much bigger game. If the person in charge was as powerful as Aaron suggested, it meant the conspiracy stretched into places Claire had never imagined. When they finally arrived at the safe hotel, Paul helped Aaron out of the car while Claire took one last look around, making sure they weren't being followed. They went up to the reserved room, where Aaron, exhausted, collapsed onto the bed. Claire approached, her expression determined. "Aaron, you need to tell me everything you know. This man who's behind it all, you must have some clue. Anything." Aaron took a deep breath, still trying to recover from the recent trauma. "I don't know his name, but I overheard conversations between the thugs. He controls political figures, people in the media, big businessmen, and, scarily enough, he has allies within the DA's office itself." Claire frowned. "In the DA's office? You're saying he has people on our side working for him?" Aaron nodded, her face tense. "Yes. And that explains why Spencer's been acting strange. He's not just being blackmailed, he's part of the scheme. Palladino works for this figure, but it's Spencer who ensures the legal system stays on their side." Claire's stomach turned. The person she trusted most was actually covering up a web of crimes. She stood up, unable to sit still, and started pacing around the small room. "So Spencer, he's been playing the game all along. Every decision he made, every time he told me to drop the Martin case, it was all to protect this person." Paul, who had been silent until now, stepped closer. "This is bigger than we thought. If Spencer is compromised, the whole system could be corrupt. And if we try to expose this, it won't just be the three of us against Palladino and his thugs, we'll be fighting an entire empire." Claire stopped pacing, her gaze locked on Paul. "It doesn't matter. I can't let this slide. If we keep backing down, they win. Martin died for this, Aaron almost died for this, and now we know enough to take them down. We need a plan, something big. We can't just sit around and wait." Paul sighed. "So what do you suggest?" "If we go to the police, Spencer could interfere. If we take it to court, they have enough allies to destroy any evidence we find." Claire knew he was right. The enemy was everywhere, and any rash move could be their last. Suddenly, Aaron spoke up. "What if we use the system against them?" Claire and Paul turned, intrigued. "What do you mean?" Claire asked, moving closer to Aaron. "They're hiding in the shadows, using power and influence to control everything without being seen. But if we expose this publicly, in a way they can't control, they won't be able to cover it up." Paul frowned. "You mean going to the press? That's risky. They can silence journalists too." Aaron shook her head. "Not just the press. We need something bigger. Something that shows everyone what's happening in real time. If we gather enough proof, we can hold a press conference, involve people who are still on our side, and most importantly, use the media to expose everything live. They won't be able to silence everyone at once." Claire could see the idea taking shape in her mind. If we can catch Spencer in the act, directly involved with Palladino, we'll have a shot at taking them both down. But we'll need solid evidence and make sure everyone knows what's happening all at once. We need something that can't be erased. Paul looked thoughtful. We have to move fast. If Palladino and his boss catch wind of what we're doing, we'll be immediate targets. Are you sure this is what you want to do? Claire nodded, without hesitation. I've already passed the point of no return. They tried to kill me, they tried to kill Aaron. Now it's our turn to strike back. That same night, while Aaron rested and Paul made some calls, Claire began mapping out the plan. They needed outside allies, trusted journalists, an independent judge, maybe even a politician willing to fight against the system. But above all, they needed the most crucial piece of evidence, Spencer's involvement with Palladino. Only then could they expose the connection between political power and the mafia controlling the city. By the next morning, Claire was already on the phone, arranging a meeting with an investigative journalist Martin had trusted. Paul was tracking Spencer's whereabouts, while Aaron worked to recover encrypted data Palladino had tried to hide. Everything was moving fast, and Claire knew any misstep could be fatal. But then, something unexpected happened. A new message appeared on Claire's phone. This time, it wasn't a threat, it was a confession. I know what's happening. Meet me tomorrow. Spencer isn't what he seems. The sender? Mark Spencer. Claire's stomach churned. Everything was about to change. But was this an act of desperation from Spencer? Or another trap? As she prepared for the meeting with her boss, Claire knew the big reveal was near. And with it, the truth would finally come to light, no matter the cost. Spencer's message echoed in Claire's mind as she prepared for the meeting. Paul and Aaron, equally suspicious, tried to convince her to avoid the risk, but Claire knew this was her chance to get definitive answers. If he's scared, this could be our opportunity. But I need to be sure it's real, she said, gripping her phone tightly. Or it could be a trap, Paul countered, his dark eyes filled with concern. Spencer is deeply involved with Palladino. If he's really caving, it could be out of fear, or it could be his last trick. I know, Paul. That's why I'm not going alone. I'm taking you both with me, but from a distance. If he tries anything, we'll be ready, Claire said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. Aaron, still weary, nodded in agreement. If Spencer's willing to talk, we need to push him. He might be feeling cornered, and we can use that against him. With the plan set, Claire, Paul, and Aaron headed to the location Spencer had marked, a secluded park on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by trees and empty trails. It was the kind of place where anything could happen without witnesses. The gloomy atmosphere heightened the sense of urgency. When Claire reached the meeting point, the tension was palpable. Spencer stood near a wooden bench, his face gaunt with deep circles under his eyes and an expression of exhaustion. He looked like a man on the verge of collapse. Claire, he began, his voice trembling, I don't have much time. They're watching me. Palladino, he's not the real threat, but you already know that, don't you? Claire approached cautiously. You're involved in this, Mark. You've been protecting Palladino all along. And now you want to tell me he's not the boss? Spencer shook his head, desperation clear in his eyes. You don't understand. I've been coerced from the start. Palladino used me, but the real boss is above him. He controls everything. I tried to get out, but there's no way out. The only reason I'm here is because I know they're going to kill me anyway. And you're next, Claire. Who is he, Mark? Who's behind all of this? Claire pressed, her patience running thin. She needed a name, the final piece to bring the whole operation down. Spencer glanced around nervously, as if expecting to be interrupted at any moment. His name is Richard Walker. He's the real boss. A former politician, with ties that stretch from the mafia to the judicial system. He's been building this network for decades. Palladino's just a pawn. Walker put me in my position, and I did what he told me, until now. A shock ran through Claire's body. Richard Walker, a highly respected public figure, known for his involvement in justice campaigns and political reforms. A man no one would ever suspect. Walker? He's behind all of this? The thought seemed impossible to grasp. Before Spencer could answer, the sudden screeching of tires on asphalt echoed through the park. Claire turned and saw a black car speeding toward them. Panic set in. It's too late? Spencer muttered, his eyes wide with fear. The next few seconds felt like an eternity. The car skidded to a halt, and armed men jumped out, opening fire without hesitation. Claire dove to the ground, pulling Spencer with her, as Paul and Aaron sprinted toward them, guns drawn. Chaos erupted in the park, gunfire ringing out through the trees. Claire, we need to get out of here. Paul shouted, taking down one of the shooters. Aaron, hiding behind a tree, managed to hit another man, but the gunfire continued. Spencer, still on the ground next to Claire, groaned in pain. He had been hit. "It's too late for me," he said weakly. "But you can still expose everything. Don't let Walker win." Claire looked at him, his shirt soaked in blood. "Mark, stay with me. You can testify, take down Walker." But Spencer gave one final breath, and his eyes closed. Claire felt the loss hit her like a deep blow, but there was no time to grieve. "Paul! Aaron! We're leaving now," she shouted, as Paul provided cover, taking out the remaining gunmen. The three of them sprinted toward Paul's car, hearts racing. When they finally escaped the park, Claire knew time was running out. Richard Walker wasn't just the boss, he was the system. And now, they knew enough to bring him down. But that meant acting fast. Hours later, in a safe apartment, Claire and Aaron organized the files of evidence they had gathered throughout their investigation. They needed to be meticulous, detailed, and quick. The press conference was scheduled for the next day, live, and nothing could go wrong. Paul, on the phone, made the final connections with trusted journalists and allies in the judiciary. "This is going to shake everything. If this works, Walker will be finished," he said, hanging up the phone. Claire took a deep breath, staring at the laptop screen. The evidence was there: financial transactions, signed documents, recordings of meetings with Palladino, and now, Spencer's confession about Walker. This has to work. It's our only shot. The next morning, the press conference hall was packed. Journalists from all major news outlets waited anxiously. Claire, standing alongside Aaron and Paul, was ready to face the world. As she stepped onto the stage, she knew there was no turning back. "Today, we are here to expose a network of corruption and crime that spans the highest levels of power in the city," Claire began, her voice steady. "The man behind this network, the one truly responsible, is Richard Walker. He has manipulated the system for decades, but today, we bring the evidence to unmask him." The tension in the room was palpable. As the evidence was displayed on the screen behind her, the truth finally came to light. Walker, Palladino, Spencer, they were all connected, and there was no way to escape. The impact was immediate. Headlines exploded across every media outlet, and within hours, arrest warrants were issued. Richard Walker, the untouchable, had finally been taken down. Later that day, as Claire watched the news of the arrests, Paul approached her, a tired smile on his face. "You did it, Claire. Martin would be proud of you." She smiled back, but her eyes remained fixed on the screen. "We took down Walker, but the system is still broken. Justice is blind, Paul, but sometimes, someone has to open its eyes." The victory was bittersweet. The cost had been high, but for the first time in a long while, Claire felt that the truth had, in some way, prevailed. The truth is a powerful weapon, but it can also be the downfall of those who reveal it. In Code of Silence, we saw that the system meant to protect justice often becomes its greatest enemy. But this brings up an even deeper question: do we really want to know the truth? When power, corruption, and money are so deeply intertwined, can exposing it all truly change anything? Or is the system so corrupt that the fall of one powerful figure just clears the way for the next one to take the throne? It's easy to talk about justice when we're not the ones facing the consequences. So, what's more dangerous, the corruption we know, or the truth we ignore? Share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel to keep following stories that challenge our notions of justice. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new legal thriller.